Hello, and welcome to Trinity Bible Media. Today we're going to begin our introduction to the book of Genesis. Now, when I say introduction to Genesis, don't take that to mean that we're going to do a survey of Genesis. A survey and an introduction are two radically different things. A survey is a short, high-level overview of a book with most of the focus being on its content. It would cover most of the basic elements of the storyline without much detail and without much nuance. I guess you could say that it gives you kind of the gist of the book. If you've ever watched a video from a YouTube channel called The Bible Project, then you'd be familiar with the concept of a survey. When The Bible Project covered the book of Genesis, they divided it into two different videos with a total runtime of just over 11 minutes. Check that against the total runtime of this series, which will probably end up being several hours. And then consider that we're not even going to get into the first verse, and you'll quickly realize that this series is clearly not a survey. No, this series is an introduction, which is a completely different animal. Introductions are part of more in-depth studies that provide the student with information that's important to know in order to understand what a text is really saying. It answers questions like who wrote it, to whom was it written, when was it written, why was it written, and what kind of writing is it? How we answer each of these questions can greatly impact how we interpret the text. And so this series will feature at least a couple of videos covering different aspects of those questions, with each episode being between, say, 5 and 10 minutes long, at least in theory. We'll start with Mosaic authorship, discussing why the topic is important and why we can be confident that Moses was actually the primary author. And then we'll present the most prominent theory from critical scholarship before turning that theory on its head and showing why it's so futile. Then we'll move to the audience of Genesis and spend a fair amount of time talking about the pagan cultures that infected those early Israelites. We'll talk about the creation myths of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Canaan, and how Moses interacted with those stories when he wrote Genesis. After that, we'll talk about genre, or the type of writing, and interpretation. Really, I'm wanting this series to dovetail into a broader series on creation. So after a general discussion of genre, we'll focus the discussion on the first 4 chapters of Genesis, leaving the other chapters for another day. Now, you may be thinking, aren't those the sorts of things they study in seminary? The answer is, of course, yes. Those are the sorts of things they study in seminary. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't study them too. These are not merely abstract, esoteric concepts best left to the academics. No, they're actually very practical for all Christians. Not only do they help us defend against critical attacks, studying these topics should also heighten our praise for the Lord. Here's a very loose analogy of what I mean by that. My wife, my kids, and I are all really big Disney World fans. Suffice it to say that we've been there a time or two. In 2017, they opened a new section of one of the parks. It was themed after the movie Avatar. Now, if you haven't seen that movie, the visuals are stunning. It's absolutely beautiful. The movie itself, well, I'm not really that big of a fan, but that's beside the point. Anyway, we walked into that new section of the park. It's called Pandora. It was really cool, and it was really immersive. It was like walking into a different world. Strange plants and animals, robots, glowing insects, floating mountains. And at night, it seems like pretty much everything lights up. It's absolutely gorgeous. But honestly, to me, Pandora just wasn't that big of a deal. I would walk by something like a big weird looking plant or a robot or some kind of prop. I could tell that it had some significance to the movie or to the story in general, but I really didn't know what that significance was. And I really didn't care. I was more interested in how they pulled off some of the engineering challenges than I was the attractions themselves. It was more curiosity than anything. In the end, at least for me, it wasn't all that memorable. I could look at the land and say, well, that's cool. And I could look at some of the engineering and say, well, that's pretty cool too. But there was no connection between the two, between the parts and the whole. Well, in 2019, a couple of years after opening Pandora, Disney opened another new section. This one is called Galaxy's Edge, and it's themed after Star Wars. My connections with that movie reached all the way back to my childhood. It came out when I was in 5th grade. And since I've always been a little nerdy, seriously, it's true, I have some nerdy tendencies. Because of that, many of my friends have been fans as well. And so over the past 45 years, I've picked up a fair amount of knowledge about the Star Wars universe. So the first time I walked through Galaxy's Edge, to be honest, I stumbled more than I walked with my eyes popping out of my head and my mouth open. Whoa, check it out, there's an X-Wing. Well, it's a T-70, I was hoping for a T-65, but that's cool, let's get some pictures. And there's a land speeder. Oh, the Millennium Falcon. Dude, I recognized all sorts of droids and weapons, the shapes of buildings, the kinds of doors on buildings, military uniforms. I was excited about all those details because they meant something to me, both in terms of passion for the movie, but also in terms of just plain familiarity. The experience of the whole connected all of those little details together, and then those little details enhanced the wonder of the overall experience. The two fed one another. Now, most of the people who read the creation narratives in Genesis react to them in the way that I reacted to Pandora. They may notice some of the details, but those details don't mean anything to them, so they keep moving. It's not that they're not interested or that they don't love Christ, it's that they just don't know. They've never been taught the connection between those things and the larger context. What we want to do with this series is help the reader of Genesis have a more of a galaxy's edge reaction, stumbling through the text with eyes popping out and mouth hanging open in amazement. I'm telling you, Genesis 1, when you understand it in its fuller context, it's a mind-blowing, world-changing cause for celebration. But to understand that, you have to understand what was going on in the world of the original audience and what those people believed at that time. And that's just the sort of thing that we're going to study. Yes, there's going to be some academic stuff, and you will probably find some of it to be dry. But in the end, there really should be a heightened sense of thanksgiving and praise for the Lord and what He has done. It is stunningly beautiful. Well, I guess since this is our first video, it would be a good time for introductions. This whole channel, not just this series, is dedicated to providing mere mortals like ourselves with a deeper, more meaningful understanding of the Bible. Trinity Bible Media is a teaching and outreach ministry of Trinity Bible Church in Cypress, Texas, USA. Our goal is to clearly explain not only what we as a church believe, but why we believe it, all for the purpose of glorifying God. And if you agree with what we teach, then you'll know why you believe what you believe too. And if you don't agree with what we teach, well then hopefully you'll know why. Okay, one more thing before we wrap up. I want to quickly mention an important concept that's not really talked about as much as it should be. It's called presuppositions. Presuppositions are beliefs that we hold to be true at the beginning of a discussion. They're the starting point of a logical argument or line of reasoning. They're the things that we base our other beliefs on. Most skeptics hold anti-supernatural or materialistic presuppositions. They believe that the material universe, basically matter and energy, is the only thing that exists. And so they believe that everything can be explained in those terms. There's no souls, there's no spirits, no life after death, no miracles, and no gods. This means that they don't even have to read the book of Genesis to know that they don't believe it's true. They just have to hear the opening sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And they immediately toss it aside as the primitive myth of a superstitious people. No other evidence is necessary. But given their presuppositions, they can't really do otherwise. Unless they change their underlying assumptions, they can never come to a place where they recognize Genesis or any other book of the Bible as reliable or true, since in their minds it is tainted with superstition and mythology. But they're not the only people to hold presuppositions. We all do, myself included. So I'll go and throw some of mine on the table right here at the very beginning. I believe that the Bible is the inspired word of the one and only true and living, eternal and triune God, the creator of you and me and everything else. I believe that the Bible is true in all that it touches, including historical events and historical people. This means that next time, when we discuss the question of who wrote Genesis, I'm keenly interested in what the rest of the Bible has to say about it. This does not mean that I'm presupposing that Moses wrote it. What I'm presupposing is the fact that when the Bible tells us something, what it tells us is true, which is a different question altogether. So no, we're not talking about circular reasoning, and no, we're not begging the question. But the implication is the arguments I provide will not convince a committed skeptic of anything, and I acknowledge that. Like I said, the skeptic is committed to their own presuppositions. That's why, as we work through this series, I will not only make positive cases for Trinity's positions on authorship, audience, genre, and so forth, but I will also address some of the claims of the skeptics and demonstrate some of their flaws and inconsistencies without the aid of biblical authority. Okay, now we're ready to get started with our introduction, not survey, of Genesis by considering the question of authorship, which is where we'll pick up next time. I hope to see you then, and may God bless you.